Chapter 5, Relativism and Skepticism. Relativism is the view that what is true depends on what a person or a culture believes, and there are different kinds. Alethic relativism just refers to the truth. And of course, we've been operating with the correspondence theory of truth, and that is simply the view that a proposition or a claim is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. So if I say the sky is blue and the sky is actually blue, then that's a true claim. However, alethic relativism is the view that whether the sky is blue or not, or whether that claim is true or not, would depend on an individual or a culture's belief or perspective. And so relativism can be from an individual perspective, from an entire culture's perspective. It can be global about all topics, or it can be specific to particular topics, such as morality or ethics. Now, relativism at first has some intuitive appeal. It seems open-minded. It seems tolerant, peaceful, humble. Who are we to judge? Who are we to impose our views on others? Why don't we just sit back and say, well, if that's a truth for you, then okay, it's a truth for you. However, there's a danger here. When anything goes, this invites egocentric manipulation. Might equals right. And this is something that Socrates' ancient enemies, the sophists, took advantage of. So they specialized in rhetoric or persuasion, and they considered the goal of conversation to be victory, not truth, power, not wisdom, to advance their agenda, not discover moral goodness or justice. Protagoras was one of these sophists. He was one of the most powerful and famous, and he advocated for moral relativism, or for just relativism in general. And he said that man is the measure of all things. And he made a brief little argument in one of the Platonic dialogues that, well, the wind is cool for some and warm for others. The same wind can hit two different people, and one will say it's warm, one will say it's cool. And those claims are true for both of them, even though they're believing things that are different. Those claims are still true for these different people. Well, such is the nature of all things. All things are relative to a person's experience or perspective, or Protagoras wanted to argue. And the danger here, here's the danger. Protagoras taught his students how to argue both sides of every case and bragged that he could teach anyone how to make the weaker argument stronger because he wasn't interested in what's objectively true. He said, since his students received no training in the pursuit of real truth or justice, this meant that if they only mastered the art of persuasion, they could have the world at their feet. What they did with it was their affair. And so the sophists washed their hands of truth and justice and morality and objectivity. And instead they say, well, it's just whatever you want to be true is true. Let me show you how to take what it is that you want and advocate for it and trick others into following it. Socrates, of course, comes to the rescue. He says, well, just because some things are subjective, this doesn't mean all things objective. Maybe it's the case that whether the wind feels cool or warm, maybe that's subjective. That's fine. Maybe that's relative to each individual. However, about the Earth's shape, whether the Earth is hollow or has a molten core. What about the atomic number of helium? Is that something that we can simultaneously disagree about and both be correct at the same time? I wouldn't think so. What about your age? However old you are. Could I believe that you're actually 65 when you're really 25? And could we both be correct at the same time? Wouldn't think so, but that's something that relativism suggests. What about which flavor of ice cream generates the most sales? That also seems to be objective, but there are subjective truths out there, such as which flavor of ice cream is most delicious. This would depend on our individual experience of how our individual taste buds interact with the flavor of ice cream and our own personal endorsement of which is most delicious. That really is subjective, and that's completely fine. Which band's music is most enjoyable? People enjoy different bands. Bands that I think are terrible, you might love. Bands that you love, I might think are terrible. And that's all right. That really is something that is subjective. But if we come back to whether or not the earth is spherical or flat, that's not something that we can disagree about in such an extreme way and both be simultaneously correct. That's beyond what our personal taste has any influence over. Another example that Herrick uses in the book is aliens, if intelligent aliens exist or not. They don't simply pop in and out of existence based on whether or not people believe in them. They either exist or they don't. Even though people disagree over them, this has absolutely no bearing on the objective matter, fact of the matter. Now, Protagoras, his relativism suggested all we can ever know is what we directly perceive. There's no way of expanding or correcting our views. We're just here, we observe, and that's what the truth is what we directly perceive. He also suggested a universal individual infallibility, that every person out there is an individual expert on everything, that no one has ever been wrong about anything whatsoever. And this is a good time to introduce a cool and common and very useful philosophical technique. It's called the reductio ad absurdum, which just means to reduce to the absurd. I don't think Herrick uses that term in this chapter, but that's what he's doing over and over again to critique relativism and a little bit later on skepticism. And here's how a reductio works. First of all, you clarify what an argument or view means. You make sure you're clear on what it means. Then you show how it entails some ridiculous implication, and then you reject it. Because, hey, if it suggests something that's absurd or ridiculous, you're going to get rid of it. So here's an argument presented, summarized in the book by Herrick from Socrates. So if alethic relativism about the truth in general, is true, then everyone is infallible. No one has ever been wrong about anything. Really, no one's ever been wrong about anything. This implication is ridiculous. It's absurd. If a view has an absurd implication, it must be false. Therefore, alethic relativism is clearly false. Protagoras. We're very sorry. If alethic relativism is true, furthermore, then critical thinking is impossible. And the very idea of self-improvement is impossible. But these implications are absurd. We can improve our thought processes. We can improve our beliefs. If a view has an absurd implication, it must be false. Therefore, alethic relativism is false for sure. Another potential problem with relativism is that perhaps its own logic undermines itself. Maybe it's self-defeating. So here's a very condensed, brief, not the most formal argument, but I think you can follow. Relativism is a view that truth depends on an individual or a culture's opinion or perception. Okay, so that's supposed to be standard. This is what relativism is. The truth is what an individual or culture happens to believe. However, this claim itself that everything is relative sounds pretty objective, doesn't it? So if you're saying the truth always depends on what a person or a culture believes, one or the other, if that's the standard for truth, and that's the standard across the board, well, that itself seems to be an objective standard, not a relative standard. And so if you're committed to relativism, premise 3, you'd have to reject it because it seems to be an objective standard. Relativism itself suggests objectivism, so relativism would undermine that, and so it's self-defeating. The whole thing unravels. All right. More reductios. If cultural relativism is true, that means not what an individual believes, what a culture believes. If that's true, then no culture has ever been wrong or ever will be wrong. No culture has ever been wrong about anything. So the easy one that comes to mind, cultures that would do rain dances, and then it would rain, and they thought that's the reason it rained. Did that really make it rain? I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think so if they believed that. Herrick uses the example of cultures disagreeing over the cause of disease. Some have believed that diseases are brought about by witches. Other cultures have believed that disease is brought about by bacteria and viruses. Scientific experimentation and trial and error show that it's not witches. Instead, it's viruses and bacteria and other things. So if you're a cultural relativist, you would have to say that those who sincerely believed it was witches, they were correct. But that's ridiculous. Now we can switch over to moral relativism. And you've got a couple of different variants here. Individual moral relativism, that whatever you believe or I believe, the next person believes is morally correct. Well, it really is correct for them if they sincerely believe it. So if that were true, then each person would be an infallible moral authority. You really want to commit yourself to that? Or if cultural relativism is true, that would mean that each culture is an infallible moral authority. Let's look at some problems with both of these. So absurd implications of personal moral relativism. First of all, you couldn't complain. So if people did awful things to you, on what grounds could you complain? They could just say, well, I sincerely believe that it was okay for me to do that. So if an awful person stole your toothbrush and washed a skunk with it and then put it back and expected you to use it, and you said, can't believe you did this. You're such a scoundrel. They could say, well, hey, man, it's completely fine according to my ethics and my morality. If you're a moral relativist, you would have to agree that it's completely fine. If you're a moral relativist, you think that morality is just a subjective opinion thing, well then, if you had a professor that said, I grade my students based on whether or not their names suggest that they're a nice person, then you couldn't complain. So if I said, all right, Susie, I like the name Susie. I think Susie's probably a nice person. But Sam, I knew a Sam one time. He was a real jerk. But he's a jerk also. So Susie, I'm giving her an A. Sam, I'm giving him an F. I don't care what they did in the class, what their actual performance was. I'm going to judge them based on this. If you came to the professor and said, I can't believe you did this, it's so unjust, so unfair, I would say, if you're a moral relativist, well, I thought you were a relativist. What's this fairness you speak of? To me, in my morality, it's completely fair, completely ethical. So that's a big problem with moral relativism. At first, it seems attractive. You're being open-minded, you're being humble, you're being tolerant. But then you realize this means people could do anything and you wouldn't be able to complain. You also couldn't improve. I mean, this suggests that whatever you're already doing, however you already behave, there's no room for improvement whatsoever. And that seems ridiculous. All of us could do better in many different ways. Cultural relativism, here's some absurd implications of that. These are similar, but one's a little bit different. So first of all, it requires social conformism. So if cultural moral relativism were true, if you're committed to that, what I should do is where I should get my morality, my ethics is from my culture, well, you would have one primary rule. That would be to completely obey your society's moral code and never criticize it. Whatever it is, wherever you find yourself, that's what you must adhere to. Whatever it means for you, whatever it means, however it might conflict with what you consider to be objective justice, your better moral sense, your intuitions, whatever. If your society says that this is okay or not okay, you would just have to adhere to it. That seems kind of ridiculous. Societies are definitely wrong in many different cases. And another side problem would be how can you even tell what the culture's values are? Cultures differ. Look at the United States right now. How you have the so-called cultural wars. People very much disagree over what's right, what's wrong. This would also preclude moral improvement. If your culture's current views determine the moral truth, well, I guess there's never been any room for improvement. There's no advancement. So you couldn't say that when the United States abolished slavery, this one was an improvement. You might say it was a mistake. You might say that, well, what their values were to enslave people, even though we're supposed to be free and created equal and all that. If you're committed to or cultural moral relativism, it's pretty stagnant. And then also it would endorse more awful things, clearly awful things, such as slavery, honor killings, genocide. The old cliche example is simply Hitler and the Nazis. If you're a cultural moral relativist, you would have to say, well, that was okay for them and it's completely morally acceptable, and I wish they would do more of it. But of course, that's ridiculous. That's absurd, so we reject it. All right, so we talked about relativism, considered how it's possibly self-defeating, and also some reductio arguments against it. Gorgias, he was a powerful sophist that advocated for skepticism. So this is similar to relativism, but it's the view that it's impossible to know the truth about reality at all. So relativism says that we can know truth about reality, but it depends on what a person believes or what a culture believes. Skepticism says that knowledge is impossible, period. Well, that gives us reason to consider what is knowledge even? Something to think about and to remember because you're a student of philosophy is that the subdiscipline of philosophy that studies knowledge is called epistemology. So remember that epistemology, subdiscipline that studies knowledge. And a classic view of what constitutes genuine knowledge is the justified true belief account of knowledge, JTB. And what the JTB theory of knowledge is that you genuinely know something if three conditions are met. And if all three of them are met, you know it. And if they're not all met, you don't know. So they're necessary and sufficient. First of all, the claim has to be true. If you believe something and it's not true, I guess this is actually second. If you believe something that's not true, it's not knowledge, it's just a belief. You have to actually believe it, which is a mind state. You're affirming that it is true and you do attest to this. You firmly think that it is the case. And then last, and this one's very important, you have adequate justification for your belief. So you just happen to be lucky and think you know something and believe something. It's not an actual genuine belief. It's just a belief. So if it's a lucky guess, did you know that thing was going to happen? No, you didn't know. You just guessed. You don't actually believe it. No, it's not genuine knowledge. You just simply want it to be true, but you don't really have a truth-oriented justification for it. That's not knowledge either. So remember that if all three of these conditions aren't met, that thing that you think you might know isn't actually knowledge. And Herrick gives the example of the word knowledge being used inappropriately by historians, for example. when they would say that, for example, it was common knowledge during the Middle Ages that the Earth was the center of the universe. Well, it would be more accurate to say it was a common belief because it wasn't common knowledge, because the Earth is not the center of the universe. It was a common misconception, I suppose. All right, here's some more reductios. And you can see the pattern here. If global skepticism is true, then we do not know that atoms are smaller than mountains or that the sun is more than a mile away. Surely we can know that atoms are smaller than mountains and the sun is more than a mile away. Surely we can know these things. And so therefore we have to get rid of skepticism. And also, if skepticism is true, then critical thinking and intellectual improvement are impossible. Surely we are all getting better right now at our critical thinking going through this class. Socrates challenged both of these. He challenged relativism, he challenged skepticism, and he challenged them because he believed that they were false, but he had a moral motive as well. And so the way Herrick puts it, he says, Socrates feared that a widespread belief in sophistic relativism and skepticism would reduce everything to individual preference and prejudice and turn philosophy from a search for truth into a means for satisfying the demands of selfishness and vanity. His response was to seek to win back by reason a deeper foundation for knowledge and morality. Have that in mind as we soon move into chapter 6 on reason and the senses.